Welcome, and thank you for attending this online seminar highlighting GTAP and CGE modeling in Africa. My name is Dominique van der Mensbrugghe, and I'm a research professor and the director of GTAP. Today's seminar will be broken into three sections. We'll start by providing an overview of GTAP in Africa, and we'll then transition to research highlights, which will feature analytical pieces from researchers in Africa using GTAP and CGE modeling in their work. Our focus will then transition to the policymakers' perspective, where we'll hear about the roles that GTAP and CGE modeling play in decision-making. At the end of each section, I'll open the floor for discussion. During these times, if you have questions or comments, please either raise your virtual hand or enter them into the chat. By way of logistics, please be aware that French interpretation is available for those connected through their computer's audio. If you prefer to listen in French, you can select that option from the interpretation menu in the meeting control panel on your screen. Again, this feature is only available to those connected through their computer audio. This seminar is being recorded, and when the recording is available, we will post it along with the presentation files on the GTAP website. Additionally, registered participants in attendance will receive a free Africa-focused release of the GTAP database. Once we have the recording finalized and posted, probably tomorrow, we'll send an email with details on how to access everything. Lastly, before I give you a brief overview of GTAP, please let me thank everyone that is presenting today and give a special thanks to Simon Mevel and Stephen Karingi from the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa for their support and joint organization of this seminar. Let me give you a brief overview of the Center for Global Trade Analysis, which everyone refers to as GTAP. GTAP is now in its fourth decade, with its inception dating to 1992. I like to brag that there isn't a trade minister or trade negotiator that isn't familiar with GTAPs, perhaps a slight exaggeration, but there's hardly a trade agreement that has been under negotiation over the last 3 decades that hasn't had at least some analysis done with the GTAP database and its associated tools. Let me say what GTAP is. GTAP is a product, and that's the database. We're currently working on version 12. The core version has expanded from the initial 15 regions and 30 commodities to 160 regions, of which 141 are individual countries and 65 sectors, covering the global economy in its entirety. At its core, the database is a global input-output table that captures the flows of products from farm and factory gate to producers and consumers. The improved geographic coverage has occurred naturally as more country databases have been contributed, but we've had significant help in the last few years to complete the gaps on the African continent. The sector expansion has often come at the express request of our many stakeholders, to which I will return to later. Second, GTAP is a common language for analysts. The first database was accompanied by the GTAP model, which was the simplest and most transparent framework for analyzing the key trade issues of the day. While there are many dialects of this common framework, this common language has facilitated comparison across studies and imparting key insights for policymakers. Third, GTAP is a source of professional development. The center offers a rich set of courses, known as GTAP-U, that ranges from an introduction to applied general economic analysis to specialized courses on topics ranging from preferential trade agreements and to the modeling of heterogeneous firms in an industry. Fourth, GTAP is a forum. Since its foundation, it has been guided by the advice of its advisory board, today composed of representatives from 33 institutions, national and international agencies, research centers and universities, and the private sectors. The advisory board provides core funding and meets once a year to provide strategic guidance to the center. Fifth, GTAP is a network. At its core, it is a communication network that encompasses over 28,000 adherents across the world, but includes a support line and listserv, our annual GTAP conference, a highly ranked economics journal, and quarterly webinars. And now we're starting this new series of regional workshops. And finally, GTAP is expertise. The center has a professional staff composed of 4 academics, a half dozen PhD level staff economists, affiliated faculty in the departments of agricultural economics and economics, and 3 support staff. This expertise.
Slides on our side.
Could please mute your mic if it's not muted? This expertise is deployed in maintaining and developing the GTAP database and model, and in undertaking policy-relevant analysis of global economic issues. Recent examples include the impacts of COVID-19 and its aftermath, including impacts on global supply chains, the economic spillovers from the war in Ukraine, and the impact on trade from carbon border adjustment measures. That provides a brief overview of the center itself. I will now pass the floor to Angel Aguiar and Simon Mevel, who will provide an overview of the GTAP database itself. Over to you, Angel and Simon.
Thank you, Dominique. Let me share my screen and then let's try to do. Can you see my slides or the presentation mode?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Is this better?
Yep.
All right. So good day, everyone. Just wanted to briefly mention something specifically regarding the GTAP database. The Center for Global Trade Analysis has been working on improving the representation of Africa in the GTAP database, first with the assistance of the World Bank and the Netherlands Partnership Program, and more recently with the contributors supported by the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. This aligns with the mission of the center to provide leadership on economic policy analysis and by fostering the collaboration to achieve better data and research outcomes. The center values international collaboration because it increases the quality of the database and therefore the analysis. So what is the GTAP database in a nutshell? Well, it is an analytical database constructed for general equilibrium models. And this is constructed at the global level so that you can perform global economic general equilibrium modeling. So in constructing the database, we try to gather various information for 200 plus countries. But in the GTAP database, you only see that the regional coverage is a subset of those 200 countries. So what gives us the possibility of displaying individual country data in the context of GTAP is the input-output table that is underneath it. But the database is more than a collection of IO tables. The IO tables provide the structure, while other datasets that we use as targets provide the actual values. And we have to reconcile macroeconomic data, bilateral trade flows, energy data, protection data such as tariffs, export subsidies, or agricultural domestic support to provide these data set to be the initial equilibrium for your modeling exercises. Currently, we're working towards the 12th version of the GTAP database. And since the 8th edition, we are maintaining a time series of GTAP databases. You can think of this structure as a snapshot of the world economy for various different reference years. If you want to know more about the GTAP database itself, more details, I will ask you to have a look at the website where we have our detailed documentation, and also at the paper that we've written in the Journal of Global Economic Analysis. My slides will be provided at the end of the seminar, and there's a reference to that. More specifically today, what I want to share with you before I pass it over to Simon is what we're going to be made available to you. We're calling this the third GTAP Africa database, which is based on the latest currently available GTAP 11, for which the reference year is 2017. Here, we've aggregated or extracted from the GTAP database the African countries that we have. So that entails 51 regions, that is African countries plus aggregated rest of the world regions, so like North America, Europe, and with full representation of the GTAP sectors. So we have 65 sectors that identify each country in GTAP. And this is put together in a package that can be further aggregated for modeling purposes. So typically we aggregate the GTAP database because of the high dimension. It's very costly to run simulations. So as a convenience tool, we aggregate the database to run simulations. The distribution that we call GTAP Ag2, this is the facility that will aggregate your database, will include greenhouse gas emissions, energy volumes, and nutritional accounts that are consistent and are satellites to the GTAP database. I provided here a link to the YouTube video that will explain how you can perform an aggregation with GTAP Ag. But just having the database is not sufficient. So I'm also referring you here to the GTAP 101, which is a fully online course. It's right now is the date for course application, and you could begin your workings with the latest GTAP database, focusing on Africa and learning more about how to perform modeling simulations in a model. I guess at this stage, I would like to stop and pass it over to Simon so that he can talk more about what are the countries that we have in GTAP and which ones have been introduced more recently with the help of UNECA.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Angel. Let me also bring up my presentation. I think you need to put yours down. Yes. Perfect. Thank you. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So before I start, let me also take this opportunity to thank GTAP colleagues, Dominique, of course, Angel, Ginger, and Tom. It's really a pleasure to be collaborating with you on this seminar, and we are really grateful that you have been taking the lead to organize it. I also want to thank everyone attending. I'm seeing the number of the people connected, and very pleased to see that we are right now at 231 of us connected online. So this is a very good sign of the interest of GTAP on the continent. So as Angel has indicated, what I'm going to do, it's going to be a relatively quick intervention, but I want to really focus on the efforts that we have been making at ECA to help filling the gap when it comes to the coverage of individual African countries on the main GTAP database. So how do we do this? So essentially, we work very closely with national offices in charge of statistics across the continent, and we compile what we call supply and use tables for the countries that we are working on. And then after we have compiled the SUTs, we transform them into input-output tables in GTAP format. So GTAP colleagues, and especially Angel, are guiding us when we do this. And then after they take over to incorporate the table of each country for which we have collected the relevant information in the GTAP database. So for us, before I go to the coverage, just also to say that in parallel, we do collect detailed household survey, so the latest data that we could get, and as detailed as possible with gender disaggregation and other socioeconomic characteristics that we can get on the household. So that for us, this is very handy because with GTAP database, we can undertake policy analysis, and then when we collect the household survey, we can also look at the poverty and the inequality implication of various policies that we are looking at. What I want to show you now, it's really how the coverage of African countries has evolved in the past few years in GTAP database. So here on the map, you can see in blue color, these were the countries that were covered in GTAP, so the African countries that were covered individually in GTAP at the end of 2020. So you have 27 of them. And then we started doing work on the data collection at ECA in early 2021. So these are the progress that we have made throughout the 3 years here. So in 2021, for example, you can see that we have been able to collect information to add 4 countries in GTAP. So you have Gabon, Congo, Comoros, and Chad. Then in 2022, we have been able to add 5 countries. That's on the yellow ones. So the ones that have been added are Niger, Mali, Equatorial Guinea, Eswatini, and Central African Republic. And the other 4 that you see in yellow, Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, Botswana, and Zimbabwe, if I'm not missing any, were the ones for which we have collected information to update the table in GTAP, because there are some countries where we see, especially on the continent, where data had been collected long ago, and there is clearly a need to update the structure of the economy as close as possible to the current situation. And so we are also contributing to that. In 2023, we collected, just to mention that Algeria also was added in 2022, but this was not through our effort at the ECA. Then in 2023, we collected data to add 2 countries, the Democratic Republic of the Congo and also Mauritania, and Mauritius was one country for which we collected data to update it. So this year we are continuing the efforts. So that you can see that on the right side. This is the red, the countries in red. We have started the work in all of them, 5 countries in total. 4 where we are going to be able to add countries in the database. So that's Angola, Sao Tome and Principe, Burundi, and the Seychelles. And then Madagascar is one that we are going to be able to update the table in GTAP. So that would take us from, at the time we started collecting information for GTAP, we had 27 countries. And we hope that by the end of the year, and we will get there, we will have 43 African countries that will have been covered individually in the GTAP database. 6 of them for which we have been able to update the information. So obviously we want to continue moving forward because we have 54 member states. So there are still 11 countries to cover on the continent, and we want to get there. We want to be able to have covered all the 54 countries. Of course, that will depend on the budget that we can secure to be able to go on the same pace or maybe faster, or if we may not able to raise as many resources as we would like, we will slow down a bit, but we really want to be able to have all the 54 countries covered in the database as quickly as possible. Now just, and I will finish on that slide, that's the last one. For us and other researchers and many of you that are connected today, I'm sure you have an interest in getting updated information on African countries and having more African countries that are being covered on the database, because like us, you undertake analytical work. And for us, that's very important because we really try to look at priority issues for African member states. And here is a list of recent work that we have been undertaking using the GTAP database through CGE modeling at the ECA. So one that we finalized last year was on the implication of the AfCFTA for poverty and inequality. Obviously, the data we have collected on household survey was very useful here. One piece that we just finalized in collaboration with the CEPI, the Centre d'études prospectives et d'information internationale, French acronym, a research center that is well known for the quality of data that they collect and also the modeling work that they do. So we work with them on a paper that looked at greening the implication of the AfCFTA agreement. Also with CEPI, we are working right now, we are in the final stage, working on a paper on implementing the AfCFTA agreement and the implication for regional value chains in Africa. And also with CEPI, we are working on another paper where we are looking at moving from the AfCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area, to an African Customs Union. We are about to start work at ECA on assessing the implication of the European Union carbon border adjustment mechanism and what it means for African countries. And this is something that we are planning to finalize before the end of this year. Not all the papers are available online, and but once they will be available, you will be able to access them from the link that is provided here on the slide. And of course, we will share the slide after the event. So thank you so much, and Dominique, over to you.
Thank you very much, Angel and Simon. Fantastic presentation. Next, I'd like to welcome Stephen Karingi, who is the Director of the Regional Integration and Trade Division at the UNECA. Stephen has been very active in the GTAP network for many years and has served as the ECA's GTAP Advisory Board representative since 2005. In 2013, Stephen was awarded the Alan A. Powell Award for Outstanding Service to the GTAP Advisory Board in recognition of his leadership through hosting and supporting GTAP events, mobilizing I/O tables, leading policy analyses, and ensuring that GTAP realizes its maximum possible impact in Africa. Stephen is here today to give his viewpoint on GTAP's evolution in Africa, as well as its future directions. Stephen, you have the floor for around 10 minutes.
Thank you so much, Dominique. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Let me also thank the Center for leading in the organization of this. Ginger, as always, thank you very much, and Anchor. And I also want to thank you, Simon, for the presentation that you have made on the work that's been doing at the ECA. Let me take a minute just to to tell everyone who is the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. I don't want to take it for granted that you all know. Well, we are an organization that was established by the United Nations ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council, back in 1958. And essentially, we've been engaged. Our main mandate is basically to work as a think tank and on socio-economic development issues on the continent, and also to foster regional cooperation. And of course, what we do, we also want to make sure that Africa is takes its rightful position in the global table, even as we work with our member states to support in their work. So now I have, like Dominique has said, I've actually been involved with CGE modeling for many years, but with GTAP, it has been 24 years. And over these 24 years of interacting with GTAP, the world has changed a lot, both structurally and also geopolitically. And I say structurally because if you look at the weight of the different economies today, you consider how it was 25 years ago, it's quite different. Now, the only thing that has not changed is the weight of the African economy in the global economy. But the importance of the African economy in the global value chains, for instance, continues to be very significant. And in fact, as we look into the future, geopolitically speaking, the importance of the African economy and the African economies individually continues to be very, very important. So the role of Africa, its economy, and also its interaction with the world has changed. So how have we used, what has been the relevance of GTAP database and the CGE modeling in this context? Let me start by saying that many African countries are members of the World Trade Organization. Many countries in the world form what we popularly know as regional trading agreements. And in this respect, there are very many countries out there that also want to come up with regional trading arrangements with Africa and with African countries. You can have in mind here European Union and the existing economic partnership agreements. We also have unilateral arrangements. For instance, the the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which is basically a unilateral preferential system which the United States has with the eligible African countries. Now, in all these arrangements, one would want to have a good understanding what's in it for Africa, how and what's in it also for the other partners in that, and what's in it for the rest of the world. And so what at the Economic Commission for Africa we have done is basically, as a think tank within this continent, to use the GTAP database and CGE modeling to work closely with the African Union. And when I say the African Union here, I mean the African countries, the African Union Commission, the AfCFTA Secretariat, to try to analyze what these arrangements mean, so that whenever there is negotiations or wherever there are conversations, the African negotiators and the African policymakers have a good understanding of what it means for the development objectives of the continent. So we have actually used this to inform the WTO negotiations, which of course Doha round, which broke down, also to inform the positions that African countries took under the Economic Partnership Agreement, and also in the reform of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which is renewed, used to be renewed 5 years, now it's every 10 years. And we had a lot of input based on the work that we have done with other think tanks like Brookings Institution to inform the conversations between the American government and the African governments. Now, coming closer home, I said that one of our main mandates is to foster regional cooperation. And it's not just to foster regional cooperation for the sake of it, it's towards the transformation of the African economies. And we also have the institution that you know very well, the African Union, which provides political leadership. And under that political leadership, we have something called the Abuja Treaty, which is a treaty that foresees eventually the establishment of an African Economic Community. So using this pillar of Africa's development trajectory, we have made use of the GTAP database and also the CGE modeling, like you have heard from Simone, to have a better understanding of how we can create one market, that is the African market. And that is how we ended up informing what we call the African Continental Free Trade Area. I know there are a lot of researchers here, and I hope most of you have had an opportunity to try to familiarize and also look deeply onto the African Continental Free Trade Area. Now, in those using this GTAP database and leveraging especially on the disaggregation of the African countries, as Simone has said, we've actually been able to provide better insights to the countries, both the developing African countries and LDC African countries, those which are also landlocked, to have a better understanding of what the AfCFTA has for them. And this has been very useful because, you know, negotiations are not easy. There is an expectation that there could be win-lose. But using this GTAP database and using CG modeling, and given that you are opening up both goods and you're also opening up services, you're dealing with the non-tariff barriers, we are able to demonstrate that actually you can actually have a win-win situation in terms of the benefits from the AfCFTA. But much more importantly, it's also possible to use the results of this CGE modeling to overlay them to see what happens at the country level. So when it comes to the implementation of the AfCFTA, using the global GTAP simulations, we've been able to use the household survey data that Simone has mentioned to be able to show what is happening in individual countries, what is happening to the inequality, to the poverty issue, to the distribution between men and women, urban and rural. And this has been one of the key things that we have found quite useful from the work using the GTAP database and also the CGE modeling. And so rather than the days before when negotiators or policymakers would sit and start discussing and negotiating outside a consistent framework using the CGE modeling and also the consistent GTAP database at the global level, we are able to tell the story of what is happening in the African region and individual African countries. Now, going forward, I would want to say that from when I started working with the GTAP database, at that time we used to focus a lot on issues to do with trade. But today, everybody is talking about the question of climate change, environmental sustainability. And the good thing is that the GTAP database has satellite databases that allow us now to tackle some of these emerging issues, like what you have heard from Simo. We've looked at what does the AfCFTA mean for the issue of the quantity of carbon emissions or the volume of carbon emissions from Africa. And what does it also mean if African countries implement their nationally determined contributions? What does it mean to the industrialization process in Africa and the regional value chains that we anticipate to see? So all these emerging new issues, we've actually been able to tackle them and engage in the discussions and in the debates as Africa, and also as individual African countries, because now we have a framework that can help us to think consistently in a consistent way with not only among ourselves, but also with the rest of the world. So I would want to stop here. I'm happy to answer specific questions, but rather than to say that this framework and its database, the CG modeling and the database, has actually been a very useful complementary means to support the policymaking processes in Africa. And of course, we accompany it with other techniques that other people may be using. And so you can actually triangulate and be able to tell a complete story. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for your insights on GTAP in Africa. I know from our long experience how much persistence has paid off, both from the center's point of view, but also from the point of view of the work that you've done for the UNECA. We're going to open the floor for roughly 10 minutes, questions and comments. If you want to ask a question or comment on the three presentations, just type a question in the chat or raise your virtual hand. And I hope I can manage to see everything as it comes through. So who wants to go first? I see in the chat comment from Kahsay. In this GTAP dataset and CG modeling, can we see the individual heterogeneity of the countries and also households heterogeneity within countries? I can take a crack at that. So there is a lot of heterogeneity across countries, and that will be picked up in the structure of their input-output tables, including the structure of production, agriculture, mining, industry, and services. It will be picked up in the heterogeneity of their trade relations, both in terms of what they're trading, what they're exporting, what they're importing, and with whom. Since it's a global database and a global model, we pick up all those bilateral relations, which will include trade barriers such as tariffs. The database does not have within-country heterogeneity across households. That is a huge task, which would be of huge importance if we could manage to do it. It's a very, very difficult. There have been versions of the database where households have been broken out for one or a handful of individual countries. One of my PhD students last year did it for India. She added 20 representative households to the GTAP model and included those 20 representative households for India. but it is a huge task. I know, Stephen, you mentioned it. I don't know, are you, or is UNECA working in this direction? Now, the alternative, of course, is to use microsimulation analysis. So, couple microsimulation with the CG model. I don't know, Stephen, what strategy have you been using?
Well, I can answer, but I'll let Simon answer that because he talked about it on the inequality and the poverty angle.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Dominique, and thank you for the question as well. So yes, indeed, as you said, Dominique, so what we have been doing for our analysis of poverty and inequality, we first run the CGE model. So we use a top-down approach. We first run the CGE model, and then we use, key variables as input to a macro simulation model, which is an econometric analysis that we do. And so definitely we see a lot of heterogeneity. Of course, what we get from the CGE framework is driving a lot of the results, but then across countries, there are very different socioeconomic characteristics that we can capture through the household surveys. For instance, when we have been looking at the implication of the AfCFTA for poverty and inequality, we do see that the AfCFTA, the implementation of the agreement would have a clear positive impact in terms of reducing poverty, but it would be very different across countries. So not all the countries are impacted the same way. And then within the household, you can also see, interestingly, that men would tend to benefit more than women. And that is the case in nearly all of the countries that we have analyzed. The same, poverty is rural today in Africa and would remain so, even with the implementation of the AfCFTA, and so on and so forth. So we can have very, differentiated impact across countries. And this for us is very important because, there have been a protocol that has been negotiated under the AfCFTA looking at women and youth in trade. And so that means that much more needs to be done to facilitate the empowerment of women and women traders on the continent. So that's why I can add briefly.
Thank you, Simon. There are a couple of questions relating to training. So the center provides or has a series of courses. We call it GTAP U. So we have an intro level course called GTAP 101, which is fully online. So I think relatively easy to take from anywhere and with minimal cost since there's no travel involved. We have our standard short course, which more advanced and which many people take. That's a hybrid. So we have 6 or 7 weeks of online training and then 1 week of training on site, typically here at Purdue. On occasion, we do it elsewhere, but we haven't done that in quite a few years, actually. And then we have more specialized courses. So we have one devoted, for example, to preferential trade agreements, as we call that GTAP PTA. So that would certainly be of interest to many of you working on the African Continental Free Trade Arrangement. So there are multiple opportunities for training. Okay, I'm having a hard time keeping up to date on the chat because there's so much coming in.
Dominique, how about this one from Pravita Shah?
Pravita Shah.
Can we do impact assessment on local content on GDP and job creation using GTAP data?
So you would have to use a CG model. You could use the GTAP model, of course, which is the basis of many of these studies. And if there are changes in trade policies, for example, the AfCFTA, that will change the incentives to import and export across countries. And the model would pick up then the impact on GDP. The impact on employment depends a little bit on what you assume about labor markets. So you would certainly pick up displacement of workers across sectors. For example, if you reduce an import barrier, that would typically displace domestic industries, and you would see workers moving towards more the export industries. So that type of displacement are kind of a natural feature of the CGE analysis, and that would be picked up. Whether it's employment creating or not, it depends a lot on what you assume how labor markets are working. In our standard closure, we assume that employment is fixed and changes at the macro level get reflected in changes in wages. But there are versions of the model where we assume that wages are rigid or semi-rigid, and in that case, changes in trade policies can be employment creating on a net basis, or you might see an increase in unemployment. That depends a lot on a country by country basis. So, and there are more sophisticated ways of modeling the labor markets in countries. And if you're interested, we can certainly provide you with a fuller set of references.
There's one in here. How about, can we get GTAP models formulated using Excel or enable a link to Excel?
A very good question. My personal bias is not to use Excel for modeling purposes. It gets very easily very messy, especially when you have multiple countries, multiple sectors. I personally have a version of a global CG model running in Excel, but it's a very simple one, and I use it mainly for training purposes rather than for policy analysis. Now, many people do at the same time link the results from the models. If you're using one of the standard tools, be it the GEMPACK version of GTAB or some other tool, we often will have links. We will link the output of the simulations to Excel or to other downstream packages. More sophisticated users are using R and Python to visualize the results and things like that, or Power BI. So there are many kind of downstream linkages, but I think for if you want to do serious policy analysis, you probably limit yourself to using kind of the standard packages.
All right, I'm just scrolling through the list. Here's the next one I see. I would like to know if we can analyze the participation of countries in global value chains.
Of course. I mean, that's one of the strengths of the database and the model is that you know when an industry in country X, you know how much that industry is purchasing from country Y of specific commodities. So you take the iron and steel sector in Côte d'Ivoire, for example, where you know how much iron ore it is purchasing from Benin. You know how much energy oil it's purchasing from Nigeria. So that's really the one of the core strengths of the database is that all of those. The entire value chain is there's data there, and you can model that explicitly. Given the impacts, and you can look at the references on the work that we've done and others have done on the impacts of COVID-19 on the value chains, and there's been a lot of work done on that in the last 3 or 4 years. So it's really one of the core strengths of CGE modeling.
Maybe if I can add here, in fact, Simo just mentioned that we will be presenting this paper at the GTAP conference, the next GTAP conference, Simo, in Colorado University. And we have looked at the implications of the AfCFTA on the evolution of on regional value chains within the continent. And using this database, as described by Dominique, we've even been able to identify the key sectors where Africa can really create strong regional value chains, from agri-food, pharmaceutical, automotive sector, textiles and clothing. And with that, you're also able to see how different countries can get engaged in each of those value chain, and subsequently, of course, to the global value chain. Yeah. Okay, I think I'm sure there are more questions, and we'll try and answer them individually. But for the sake of time, I think it's time for us to move on ahead. So we're going to go to section 2 of the workshop, which is really highlighting some of the recent research being done by researchers in Africa using GTAP and CGE modeling. Our first presentation is on targeting untapped intra-regional trade opportunities for trade integration in Africa, and will be jointly presented by Lorainne Ferreira and Ermie Steenkamp, both from the School of Economic Sciences at Northwest University in Potchefstroom. Sorry for the pronunciation, in South Africa. Lorainne is a senior lecturer, and her primary research interests focus on strategy and practices that facilitate export promotion and management, including a focus on advanced regional trade integration and development. Ermie is an associate professor, and her research primarily focuses on international market selection, export promotion, and the measurement of market accessibility and regional trade integration. Lorainne and Ermie, the floor is yours, and you can share your slides. You have roughly 10 minutes for a presentation.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for this opportunity. As you heard, we are more focused on international trade integration in Africa, identifying regional trade opportunities in Africa. But yeah, that's my and Lorainne's main research focus. But our third author here, Oluwasola E, he's the GTAP specialist. He helped us with combining what we do in GTAP and to use GTAP to see what the impact of our research can be. So, yeah, I'll just start explaining what our research is all about. Okay, so obviously we all know that intra-African trade is an important driver to integration in the region, but turning the policy intentions into action has been a slow process in Africa. We see many inefficiencies, trade inefficiencies, and that's why we also shock the trade efficiency variable in the GTAP model. But a little bit later we'll explain that better. Then normally policy takes a broad approach to try and lower tariffs and increase trade efficiency, lowering border delays, addressing poor infrastructure, and making trade more effective in Africa. And many existing studies has implemented the GTAP model to simulate these broad approaches and to see what the impact thereof can be. So in this research, we took a more targeted approach. Like I said, my research focus and Lorainne's is more on identifying international trade opportunities, international market selection, and then trade integration and your regional integration and regional exploring regional opportunities. So we identify untapped realistic trade opportunities. So if we talk about trade opportunities, it is on an importer, it's an exporter, a product, and an importer. So it's on a very specific product level, on an HS 6-digit level, where we identify trade opportunities. And specifically in this research, we used the 26 TFTA countries and identified bilateral trade opportunities between these countries on a very specified HS 6-digit level. Okay, and then we translated these opportunities. So I'll explain how we identify the opportunities just now, but we translated these potential values that we calculate for each opportunity into GTAP model shocks, and specifically shocks in lowering tariffs, and then in addition to eliminating all tariffs, increasing trade efficiency. Okay, so to identify the trade opportunities, we look at the import demand side, looking at markets. We use 26 African countries where there's a growing and large import demand, and then matching those to the same countries, but then to their export supply capacity. So saying that if a country can export a product competitively, then we consider that as they having the export supply capacity. So we match the import demand, that is total import demand from the world, to export supply, but within the region. And then we analyze actual trade in these opportunities. So if there's a match, so there's supply and there's demand in export supply and import demand, then we analyze actual trade, and then for this research we focus in on the zero or the untapped trade opportunities where the actual trade values are zero. So that means that the importer has a demand for the product that is growing. That's a total demand from total imports from the world, and the exporter has an export supply capacity. So they do specialize in exporting the product, but there's no trade within between these two African countries that actually do have potential to trade. The real actual trade is zero. So what we did is we used and focused on these totally untapped export opportunities and calculated the potential value for each of these. Like I said, it's a exporter, and then a HS 6-digit product code, and then the importer match. And then we calculate the potential value for each of those, which is more or less the average market share of each producer or each supplier in the destination country, and then taking the exporter's supply capacity into account as well. So then we translate these potential values. So if there's between two countries, we add up all of these potential values and then translated that potential increase in trade into a shock in trade efficiency. So Lorainne will explain that the shocks and the application in GTAP a bit further. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ermie, for that introduction and explaining how we got to this trade potential. I'm going to jump straight into the modeling part that we did in GTAP. So we used the dynamic GTAP model to analyze the economy-wide effect of realizing these identified untapped trade opportunities among selected CFTA countries. And so in scenario 1, we show that the results when all the tariffs between the selected CFTA countries were removed. In scenario 2A, we showed that what would happen if these identified trade opportunities are realized through the once-off implementation of increases in the targeted trade efficiency. But this was done in addition to the removal of all the tariffs. And finally, scenario 2B, This showed the impact if the trade efficiency shocks for the realization of these potential trade opportunities were phased in over a 3-year period. So 2B was the same as 2A, it was just phased in, and it was not a once-off implementation, which is more realistic. Next slide, please. Ermie, next slide, please. Thank you. So if we, for the sake of illustration, we kept this very simple for a 10-minute presentation, but if we look at the simulation results, and figure 1 clearly illustrates the projected changes in the real GDP after the implementation of all 3 scenarios. And this is only for the top 5 performing countries and or regions, as I mentioned, for illustrative purposes. And it clearly shows that the highest growth that we see here is when these changes are phased in over time. So that's our scenario 2B, the gray areas indicated on the graph. The results also show us that the smallest increase in GDP growth is in scenario 1, which is only the removal of tariffs. And this highlights why it's so important for it to take a targeted approach to reducing trade divisions relating to these unexploited trees. It's also, I need to mention this, and regions showed an increase in GDP growth, not just the 5 that we illustrated here. Next slide, please. Ermie, you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Then this slide, figure 2 here, shows the projected changes in the welfare of the top 5 performing countries and or regions included in each of the scenarios modeled. Again, for illustrative purposes, not including all the countries, but only those who showed the highest results. And here it's worth mentioning that we won't see gains to be distributed equally among the selected countries and regions because they have different sizes in their economies. They have different levels of export diversification, the level of their infrastructure, and also the tariff revenue losses that they will see. So what we see here is by taking a targeted, phased-in approach in increasing regional trade, the simulation results show that more countries will experience significant increases in their welfare gains. And that's why scenario 2B shows that Kenya, as we see in the figure here, experienced the biggest gains, mostly driven by endowment effects as well as terms of trade, followed by South Central Africa, which was the biggest welfare gains in terms of technological change and also endowment efficiency. Next slide, please. So if we can keep the in Sweden, we go to the main findings. What were some of the main findings that on this study? And we need to consider both existing literature and the findings that we saw in this study. And that's why it's noteworthy to see that not only the larger, more industrialized economies gain from the efforts to increase intra-regional trade, but it's also the smaller economies that we see significantly gaining from this, especially in a phased-in targeted approach, when this is used to increase trade efficiency in addition to tariff liberalization. So secondly, the implementation method affects trade efficiency outcomes. In other words, how trade efficiency measures are implemented matters. And finally, combining tariff elimination with a phased-in targeted approach to reducing trade divisions, as we saw in scenario 2B, this significantly boosts GDP and welfare, and it can also help countries to benefit, or rather smaller countries to benefit, not only larger countries, as they become more diversified and their welfare is increased. And then next slide, please. Finally, if we can make some main policy messages emanating from these results, is that government should consider the possible gains from real intra-regional trade relative to the revenue lost due to the reduction in tariffs, and gathering accurate information on untapped intra-regional trade opportunities, the applicable trade barriers, and also the potential impact of realizing this potential is crucial. And finally, this information combined with the necessary implementation commitment can potentially drive stronger intra-regional trade and deeper integration among African countries and give the African continent development efforts just greater traction. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lorainne and Ermie. I think we have some room for questions at the end of the three presentations. So let's move on to the next presentation, which is on the impact of the AfCFTA on Nigeria's agri-food sector, and will be presented by Oluwasola Emmanuel Omoju, who is an economist and senior research fellow at the Nigerian Institute for Legislative and Democratic Studies, where he provides research and policy support to the Nigerian Parliament. Oluwasola has experience working on applied development issues such as energy and climate change, trade policy, and public financial management, and his methodological approach is ex-ante impact evaluation using CGE modeling. He has participated in projects using CGE models on the GTAP database and has led a research project funded by PEP using a CGE model to assess the economy-wide impact of the Nigerian National Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Policy. He was also part of a team using the PEP Regional World Model and the GTAP database to simulate policy options for achieving a 10% GDP growth for Africa. More recently, he was part of the African Climate Foundation London School of Economics team that analyzed the economic impacts of the EU Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism on Africa. His current research project, which he will present on, is the analysis of the impact of the AfCFTA on Nigeria's agri-food sector using the Demetra CGE model. The floor is yours, Oluwasola, and I see your slides already up. You have roughly 10 minutes, yeah? So please go ahead.
All right, thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Can you please hear me? I just want to confirm if you can hear me and if you can see my slide.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, all right. I'm presenting within the next 10 minutes. I'm making a presentation on the impact of the AfCFTA on Nigeria's agri-food sector. This work was done in collaboration with some colleagues, and we acknowledge the technical and financial support of the Joint Research Center of the European Commission for this study. So I won't talk too much about what the AfCFTA is all about. I want to believe that almost everybody here have an idea of what it's all about. So I think I'll quickly go into the motivation for the study. I think there are several studies that have been done on the AfCFTA, and these studies actually show that it has great potential for boosting African trade, improving well costs are uneven. And what that means is that not all countries will benefit equally under the AfCFTA. There will be winners and there will be losers. And it's also very important to know that there are opportunities and threats across all sectors of the economy. So in this respect, it is very important that in addition to the potential continental-wide benefits of the AfCFTA, there's need for individual country level assessment. And that is basically the main motivation for this study. In terms of our focus, we are looking at Nigeria. And let me just quickly give a brief background. Nigeria has the largest economy in Africa and also has the largest population. So it's a potential big player in the AfCFTA. However, the country was actually initially reluctant to sign. And I think because there were concerns from some very important stakeholders. In addition to that, the government closed the land borders with some West African neighbors for about 2 years, basically to prevent smuggling and unregulated cross-border trade. I think there have also been several trade-related policies that are related to agricultural productivity and food security. And currently, Nigeria is facing severe macroeconomic challenges related to exchange instability, high inflation, and food security. I think as at February 2024, the food inflation rate is about 35%. So our research objective is basically to examine the potential macroeconomic and structural impact of the AfCFTA in Nigeria, and to investigate how the AfCFTA will affect the agri-food sector. Actually, this is a very big research study. I'm just bringing out some of the important aspects to present within this 10 minutes. So in terms of the method, we use the Demetra method. And for using this method, we particularly acknowledge the technical support of colleagues from the Joint Research Center of the European Commission in Seville. They provide us with the technical support for using this model. So the dimensional model is a single country recursive dynamic open economic CGE model. Just like any other CGE model, the basic assumption is perfect competition. And interestingly, the model also allows us to separate marketed and subsistent commodity, and also the maintain assumption holds. Now, interestingly, we link the dimensional model with the magnet model. The magnet model is actually a global model which uses the GTAP database and to actually capture the changes in export demand, such that we'll be able to know how the rest of the world is demanding for Nigeria's export. So for that magnet model, I think the GTAP database was used for that. So in terms of like the data, before the analysis, I think the peer-reviewed or the publicly available social accounting matrix for Nigeria was 2010. It was published in 2010 based on 2006 data. So between now and then, I think the Nigerian economic structure, in terms of like the structure and size, has changed significantly. So for this particular study, we constructed a new social accounting matrix for year 2009. And the new matrix we constructed accounts for regional activities. It incorporates home production for home consumption. And we're also able to decide, we're also able to use survey labor market data to disaggregate labor according to skill levels. And we also have regional household. So in terms of like the scenarios and the liberalization schedule, so we look at two basic scenarios. The first scenario is we are looking at tariff only, and the second scenario is we are looking at tariff and non-tariff measures. In terms of like the liberalization schedule, now we are looking at what are those key issues that are of particular interest. Maybe, for example, now in the context of the Nigerian government, one of the major reasons why the government did not sign initially was because of revenue loss. So we're trying to say in this case, now, if the goal of the government is actually to minimize revenue loss, so that is what we call the REV. Then the second liberalization schedule is agricultural trade. So in this case, that the government is interested basically in improving food access and food security. Then the third is leveraging the AfCFTA to promote industrialization. So the basic idea is full liberalization of intermediate input. And then we have the last liberalization schedule, which is a reviewed comparative advantage, which is full liberalization of sectors with comparative advantage. So as I said earlier, we have only two scenarios, the tariff only and the tariff and non-tariff measures. So in terms of like the overview of the results, I think from what we can see, we put the results of the tariff only and the tariff and NTM side by side. And from what we can see, at least let me quickly just talk about the major ones. I think we see that the AfCFTA has a very negligible impact on Nigeria's GDP. In fact, it probably has a negative impact on GDP if the GDP by expenditure method is used. But if the GDP by value added method is used, I think it has a very, very small impact on Nigeria's GDP. And we also see that the tariff plus NTM scenario has much larger trade impact than the tariff only scenario. We can also see that the import increases significantly more than export increase. And we can also see that government revenue did not fall. As I said, one of the major fears of the government in failing to sign the agreement initially was the potential loss of revenue. But as we can see from the analysis that government revenue actually did not fall, it rose because of the efficiency that was instigated by the AfCFTA. I think government was able to actually generate revenue from other sources, which offset the revenue loss from custom tariff. In terms of like the sectoral effects, we found out that the output of the industry, utilities, construction, services, and the agricultural sector increased. Actually, the industrial sector has the largest increase, while the output of public services, extractive and processed food sectors reduce. And the output of the processed food sector actually reduced, basically because of competition. And when I get to the next slide, you can see that the import of processed food actually increased significantly. Among all these 4 liberalization schedules, we see that agricultural trade liberalization schedule has a much larger effect on output than all the other liberalization strategies. And we can also see that there's a smaller output increase under the tariff and NTM compared to the tariff-only scenario. Yeah, in terms of like the effect on import and exports, the export of manufacturing, processed food, food crops, and livestock increases while mining decline. And I don't know if that's some kind of like good news, but I know over the years, the Nigerian government has been making efforts to diversify the export base. Basically, the export currently is made up of fossil fuel and solid minerals. So, and in terms of like import, you can see, just as I said, because the output of processed food reduces, the import of processed food increased significantly. In fact, more than any other commodity, and this is actually prominent for agricultural trade liberalization schedule. Why this is actually very important in terms of like making food available for people, actually, we also need to think about this food security implication of increased food importation. Now, in terms of like the employment effect, I won't spend much time here. The employment effect is actually reflective of increase, while those sectors that actually experience decline in output, employment also reduce. So in terms of like the welfare, we found out that the welfare impact is higher for rural household compared.
Hold on, can I interrupt a second? Yeah, please wrap up, yeah, because your time is up, yeah.
Okay, all right. So in terms of the welfare impact, we found out the welfare impact is higher for rural household compared to urban households. So in terms of like the main conclusion from the study, we can see that the AfCFTA has limited impact on growth, and the agricultural sector would mostly benefit, the industrial sector would mostly benefit in terms of output growth, while agricultural output will increase marginally, while processed food output will decrease. Now, in terms of like the recommendation, based on this preliminary results, we recommend that there should be complementary policies to support the AfCFTA to stimulate growth. And we also feel that there are policies needed to boost export capacity. Policy may also be put in place to protect key sectors that are likely to be negatively affected, especially the processed food sector. So I think on this note, I want to stop. So if you want to see more about the results, I think we already shared the presentation, so you can look at the interactive dashboard and you can play with the results. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sola. That was very interesting. Let's move to the final presentation in this section, which is on the climate change, trade, food security nexus in the Nile Basin, an economy-wide analysis by Tewodros Kahsay, who is an assistant professor and member of the research unit of the Department of Economics at Addis Ababa University. He obtained his PhD in environmental economics from the Free University of Amsterdam and an MSc in management of natural resources and sustainable agriculture with specialization in development and resource economics from the University of Norway, now known as the Norwegian University of Life Sciences, and his BA in economics from Addis Ababa University. His main research interests are in water economics, climate change, trade policy analysis, and agriculture. Tewodros, the floor is yours. You have roughly 10 minutes, yeah?
Thank you. On study on economy-wide assessment of the impact of climate change, trade, and food security in the Nile Basin. Okay, the Nile Basin is a quite popular basin. It is very historic, and it is endowed with several vital natural sources. but it does face several socioeconomic problems. Among the major problems are population growth is among the highest in the world, and poverty is quite pervasive in the basin, with over 30% of the population in most of the Nile Basin countries living under the poverty line. And food security is also quite serious. And food security is quite a serious problem in the basin. Even in Egypt, about 27.3% of the population is facing moderate to severe food insecurity. In the other basins, it's quite much higher, ranging between 50 to 72%. In fact, in South Sudan, it is as high as 86.4%. So almost the vast majority of the population in South Sudan is living living in a serious food insecurity situation. The hunger index score also indicates that the basin is in an alarming situation in terms of hunger, except Egypt, of course. So overall, the socio-economic condition of the Nile Basin is quite except that for Egypt. And climate change is emerging as an additional problem to the already dire food security situation in the Nile Basin. Because several studies has already indicated that the Nile Basin is quite sensitive to climate change. Given all these conditions, this study tries to address one research question. Well, it tries to assess whether the implementation of all the reforms embedded in the African Free Trade Area do alleviate the expected impacts of climate change on food security and overall economic conditions of the Nile Basin. More specifically, it tries to look into how climate change impacts the economy and the food security situation of the Nile Basin countries, and what pathways are at work in climate change to the issue of security. And second, it tries to look into whether the African Free Trade Area arrangement provides any opportunity to redress, to alleviate the economic and food security impacts of climate change. The study applies GTAP PW model, that is, it introduces water to the GTAP power version of GTAP model for the Nile Basin, and the data used is GTAP 9 database, using the latest reference year for the database, which is 2011. The regional aggregation highlights the Eastern Nile Basin, where much of the water originates and much of the water resources are utilized. And the sectoral aggregation also zooms in on major agricultural sectors that are directly impacted by climate change. The study considers several scenarios. First, it prepares a future baseline for the assessment. That is, it updates the baseline of the GTAP 9 database from 2011 to 2050, assuming there is no climate change. And this baseline, future baseline, is used as a reference to evaluate the impacts of the other 4 scenarios that include 2 climate change scenarios, one for IPCC A1 emission scenario, and a second for B1 emission scenario. The last 2 scenarios couple the climate change scenario with trade liberalization in the sense of the implementation of the African continental free trade arrangement. In implementing the trade liberalization scenario, it is assumed that tariff will be 100% of tariff will be removed by 2050, and non-tariff barriers will be improved by 70%, because already a recent study by World Bank has already assumed that by 2033, 50% of the non-tariff barriers could be improved in through the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Arrangement. So these four scenarios, the impact of these four scenarios is evaluated relative to the future 2050 baseline that assumes no climate change. Okay, so the simulation results are arranged into phases. One, I look into the effect of climate change on sectoral outputs, prices, economic growth, welfare, and GDP. Then I consider the impact of trade liberalization in redressing the impact of climate change by comparing one of the climate change scenario simulation with with another scenario that combines climate change under A1 emission scenario and trade liberalization. So the impact of climate change on crop output reveals that climate change results in reduced crop output in all Nile Basin countries. Well, the Nile Basin countries are aggregated into 4 regions. Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia are considered separate regions, and Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, and Rwanda are aggregated under the Equatorial Lakes region. So, like I said earlier, the aggregation highlights the Eastern Nile sub-basin because that is where much of the water originates and almost all of the water is utilized. So, as you can see, the crop output is quite significant under both scenarios, under both climate change scenarios. So in some cases, as high as 60%.
Let me thank, first of all 4 speakers for the really very interesting presentations. So the floor is open. We're a little bit over time. So in principle, the next section starts in roughly 10 minutes. So we have roughly 10 minutes for discussion. So please either use the chat or raise your hand and address your question to one of the presentations. There's one question in the chat from Dr. Ducouré. I can't answer for Tewodros, but I think he's using the climate simulations, so the change in temperature and perhaps precipitation to simulate the impact on crop yields in his model. That was my interpretation of his simulations.
Dominique, there's a question by Dirk Bienen, I believe, to our first presentation. The finding that a phased-in approach yields larger gains than a big bang one is quite surprising. Do you have any thoughts on why that would be?
Yeah, to Lorainne or Ermie, do you want to handle that?
Okay, I think I will go. I think the whole approach with the phased in, not having a, once off, but phasing it in is much more realistic. You're not going to have all of these gains once off. That's why we wanted to implement a phased in approach for these efficiency gains, to simulate something that's much more realistic. We saw much bigger gains with a phased in approach because I think it simulates a much more realistic approach. I mean, I don't know if you want to add something.
Yes, I might just say it's just the shock was then just distributed over 3 years to kind of see whether there's a difference between doing a one-off trade efficiency implementation, meaning that you lower the non-tariff measures with the necessary amount to realize the potential trade in 1 year, or then distribute it over 3 years. So I think that's the difference.
Okay, we have a few more questions. One from Samuel Coley for the Nigerian presentation. And I guess he wants a greater discussion on what non-tariff measures you're using and how you're lowering them. Sola?
All right, yeah, thank you very much for that question, Samuel. Yeah, I think basically non-tariff measures basically are just those things other than tariff or custom duty that influence trade. Basically, the way it is being operated in CGE modeling is just to estimate the tariff equivalent and use that as a shock in the model. So basically, that is what we did. And in terms of, I can see another question as well. If we consider the ECOWAS AfCFTA provisional schedule of tariff while running the simulation on Nigeria. So when we ran the first simulation, I think sometime last year, I think the negotiation about the tariff has not been concluded. So I think those simulations, they were just based on some ideas. But I think the latest result that we have that I just presented is actually take into consideration the ECOWAS provisional tariff. So I think that's actually take that into consideration. And also, it also includes all those commodities that were not that were classified either as sensitive or not sensitive. Thank you.
Yeah, Sola, there was a follow-up question on the ECOWAS and the sensitive and exclusion list.
Yeah, thank you, Dominique. I think I just responded to that question.
Okay.
Now. Yeah, I said, yeah, that was actually included in our simulation.
Okay. Lorainne, there was another question regarding your results, and the question was, how are you measuring welfare?
Lorainne, I'm really sorry. This is where my other colleague would have come in with the CGE analysis. I'm really sorry, not my area of expertise. We just wanted to share the results with a more targeted phase-in approach with you guys. But if you want, I can follow up with you on this after following up with Rian as well. My apologies.
Okay, no worries. There's a question regarding using GAMS and GTAP. So let me, I'll answer that one. First of all, the GTAP model is expressed in a language called GEMPAC. So, and GEMPAC and GAMS are very similar, both in terms of their syntax and in terms of solving these CG models. We've done, actually, we have a version of the GTAP model expressed in both simulation packages in GEMPAC and GAMS, and the results are identical to 5 decimal places. So whether you want to use GEMPAC or GAMS is really your own personal preference as to one package over the other. The one advantage of the GEMPAC implementation is that there's a lot of software that has been developed to make it much easier to unpack the simulation results using the GEMPAC version. If you're using GAMS, you're going to have to develop your own set of utilities to kind of describe the results. Just to give you one example, there's something in the GEMPAC version called the welfare decomposition, which is just a very useful tool for unpacking the sources of the changes in welfare from a policy shock. But that being said, both GEMPAC and GAMS are very, very similar and provide exactly the same results when the model is expressed in its exact algebraic formula. There was another question for, unfortunately, Tewodros wasn't able to finish presentation, but there was a question whether it was possible to include what on these climate change. So the question is, on these climate change simulations within the Nile basin, is it possible to include scenarios with increased irrigation? And for, I guess it's a separate question, for the Nigeria study, what is the explanation for the low or negative GDP growth under the AfCFTA? Sola, why is Nigeria seeing a negative GDP growth under the AfCFTA?
All right, thank you for that question. Yeah, I think we're still thinking about that, but I think if I have to give any explanation of that now, when we look at the sectoral effect, we see that those sectors that actually have negative effect are sectors that have very strong weight in the GDP, right? So I think those are actually sectors that contribute to the GDP, aggregate GDP significantly. So that could be one reason. I think that is my response to that question.
Okay, then there was one more question for Ermie and Lorainne. Why did you assume that TFTA will achieve full liberalization of tariffs? Secondly, which countries did you classify as South Central Africa?
Thank you for the question. So the first part is the tariff liberalization was for the countries and the sectors where there was untapped potential, trade potential. So it's the full liberalization of tariffs for those specific opportunities where there's actual potential for increasing trade. And then the South Central African cluster is what is standard in the GTAP version that we used.
Thank you, Ermie. I think the final question we'll answer here is on the availability of the GTAP model. Both the GenPack version and the GAMS version are available from our website. I think if you go to our journal, the Journal for Global Economic Analysis, and you'll see that the supplementary materials in the relevant articles provide the code for both models. So you should be able to download it from the journal website. Okay, I'm sure there are many other questions that we could continue with, but let's move on to the final section of today's workshop, which in which we're delighted to welcome policymakers in Africa who will discuss the roles that GTAP and CGE modeling play in decision making. Here we have two presentations. Our first speaker is Emmanuel Mbarga, who is Regional Advisor for Central Africa and Principal Expert for Market Access Issues in the AfCFTA Secretariat. Mr. Mbarga holds a DEA in Economic Analysis and Policies, is an expert in international trade and economic integration, and has had a long career in the Cameroonian administration, more specifically at the Ministry of Commerce, where he held positions of Deputy Director of Regional and International Commercial Relations, and was focal point of several international organizations. At the same time, he's one of the negotiators of the Economic Partnership Agreements with the European Union and Chief Negotiator of the African Continental Free Trade Area. He subsequently worked at the ECCAS Commission in Libreville from 2018 through 2020, and a senior expert in international trade at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, in charge of non-tariff barriers. For many years, he was an associate professor of international trade at the WTO and at the Cameroon School of Administration and Magistracy. He is the author of the book On the Path to Integration, Understanding the African Continental Free Trade Area, which was published by Éditions Lachman Cameroon in June 22. Mr. Mbarga, the floor is yours for roughly 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you, moderator. Do you follow me, please?
You're on. Just go to presentation mode, I think.
Yes. Can you see my screen?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you very much for giving me the floor. My slides are in English, so I will do my presentation in French, please. Okay. So let's go directly on what we have now, the main contribution of GTAP expanding statistical information basis by using GTAP database as an analytical tool. Donc, sur cette partie-là, effectivement, je vais shifter en français. Eh bien, on est d'accord que le GTAP facilite les études. Le GTAP permet de développer l'expertise et bien entendu l'expertise. Je dis donc que le GTAP facilite les études. Il permet de développer l'expertise et l'expérience, d'analyser les impacts, et les situations et in fine, de prendre les décisions idoines qui s'imposent. Alors, s'il fallait effectivement résumer le rôle du GTAP en Afrique centrale, eh bien, je dirais que la principale contribution, c'est celle d'élargir la base de l'information statistique en utilisant les bases de données GTAP comme outil d'analyse. Donc, pour moi, ça, c'est de manière ramassée le rôle qu'a pu jouer, le rôle que joue le GTAP, n'est-ce pas, au niveau de la région Afrique centrale. Alors, nous allons insister sur ce rôle-là en prenant en compte, n'est-ce pas, deux domaines. Le premier domaine, c'est le plan de mise en œuvre de la SACHA en Afrique centrale. La SACHA, c'est la stratégie pour l'harmonisation des statistiques en Afrique centrale. C'est un programme de l'Union africaine qui est disséminé, n'est-ce pas, dans toutes les communautés économiques régionales. Et là, il faut dire que le GTAP a joué un excellent rôle sur un certain nombre d'activités par rapport à la mise en œuvre de cette stratégie-là. La première activité a été l'élaboration d'une stratégie régionale de développement de la statistique. Effectivement, on s'est basé sur les instruments de la ZLECA pour pouvoir le faire. Il y a eu un autre aspect sur l'évolution ou alors l'évaluation de la fonction statistique de la CAC. La CAC ici, c'est la communauté économique des États de l'Afrique centrale. L'autre activité à mettre en exergue ici, c'est l'élaboration d'un plan de développement des statistiques économiques et sociales avec des mécanismes de collecte de ces statistiques-là. Un autre aspect qu'on peut relever ici a été la mise en place d'un dispositif sur le suivi des indicateurs de l'agenda 2063. Ça a été un excellent exercice et on a utilisé effectivement les instruments et les outils du GTAP. Et il y a un aspect sectoriel qui est important concernant le commerce extérieur. Là aussi, nous allons relever deux activités importantes pour lesquelles effectivement le GTAP a assuré un développement. L'élaboration d'un règlement régional, un règlement régional sur effectivement le traitement des statistiques du commerce extérieur. Et ce règlement aujourd'hui permet en réalité de pouvoir développer, n'est-ce pas, avec les mêmes normes, les mêmes approches, n'est-ce pas, approcher d'appareils statistiques de 11 pays étant membres de la CAC. Donc, il y a eu à ce niveau-là un essai d'harmonisation en utilisant les instruments de la statistique et on y est arrivé. Aujourd'hui, on peut se comprendre lorsque nous nous restions en Afrique centrale parce que nous parlons le même langage. Un autre aspect sur le commerce extérieur est l'élaboration d'une méthodologie pour les données du commerce informel transfrontalier avec les questions, n'est-ce pas, les questions des dames qui sont ici en évidence et qui vont revenir dans le cadre des négociations et de la mise en œuvre de la ZLECAF. Le deuxième et dernier domaine sur lequel nous voudrions nous étendre, c'est le domaine, effectivement, des négociations commerciales. On évoquera en passant les APE, Parce qu'effectivement, il y a eu, lorsqu'on négociait des APE, des études d'impact, n'est-ce pas, qui ont permis à tous les pays de l'Afrique centrale de pouvoir donc négocier avec l'Union européenne, n'est-ce pas, les questions de l'impact sur nos économies et pas la mise en œuvre des APE, avec des questions des modèles d'équilibre général et les questions d'équilibre partiel. Donc là aussi, abondamment, eh bien, nous avons pu utiliser les outils du modèle GTAP. Mais j'aimerais davantage insister ici les négociations concernant la mise en place de la zone de libre-échange continentale africaine. Et là aussi, les outils digitales nous ont permis de définir, n'est-ce pas, les positions de négociation à la fois au niveau national, mais aussi régional. Un exemple important, c'est celui de la CEMAC avec ses pays membres, le Cameroun, la Centrafrique, le Tchad, le Congo, la Guinée équatoriale, le Gabon, qui composent l'union douanière, la CEMAC, et qui a permis donc, n'est-ce pas, de développer une liste de concessions tarifaires qui est collégiale, qui concerne donc ces 6 pays-là, effectivement, en prenant en compte les modalités qui ont été définies au niveau de la ZLECAf, modalité de libéralisation du commerce. Alors, cela a consisté en quoi? Cela a consisté effectivement donc à pouvoir aller définir les groupes de marchandises concernant ces modalités. Nous avons principalement 3 groupes. Le groupe A qui est celui de 90% des lignes tarifaires, dont libéralisation courte. Le groupe B, produit, j'allais dire, essentiel, effectivement sensitif, qui permet, produit sensible, 7% de lignes tarifaires. Et le groupe C, qui prend une analyse, effectivement, avec les statistiques, dans 3% de lignes tarifaires, mais qui s'accompagne d'une double qualification. La deuxième qualification étant le critère de anti-concentration, qui permet de dire que ce groupe ne doit pas concentrer plus de 10% de la valeur des importations provenant des autres pays africains sur la base des années 2014-2016 ou 2015-2016. Là, c'est une moyenne. Donc, vous voyez ici, effectivement, il a fallu des informations qu'on est allé puiser dans la banque des données, n'est-ce pas, du GTAP pour pouvoir véritablement arriver, n'est-ce pas, à un consensus au niveau de l'Afrique centrale. Ça a permis qu'on limite le groupe C à 175 produits sur un total de lignes tarifaires d'à peu près 5850. Donc, ça a été un apport effectivement considérable. Le dernier aspect sur lequel nous allons effectivement nous étendre, c'est la question des impacts. Là aussi, il faut dire que l'instrument GTAP a permis qu'on fasse des analyses d'impact, n'est-ce pas, de la mise en œuvre de la ZLECAf sur nos économies au niveau de l'Afrique centrale et de pouvoir venir, n'est-ce pas, la mise en œuvre. Effectivement, cela est en ligne avec le fonds, n'est-ce pas, d'ajustement qui a été mis en place aujourd'hui au niveau de la zone de libre-échange continentale africaine, au niveau du secrétariat, qui va permettre en l'occurrence et en particulier donc de pouvoir voir, n'est-ce pas, les compensations par rapport à la mise en œuvre de la ZLECAf. Donc voilà un peu, mesdames et messieurs, chers collègues, ce qu'on a voulu, n'est-ce pas, partager avec vous par rapport à ce que nous avons fait au niveau de l'Afrique centrale et le rôle qu'aura joué et qui continue de jouer le modèle GTAP. Je vous remercie, monsieur le modérateur, je vous remercie, chers collègues.
Merci beaucoup, Emmanuel, pour votre perspective très intéressante. Moving on to the second presentation, our next speakers represent the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, or the COMESA Secretariat. By way of introduction, please welcome Dr. Christopher Hugh Onyango, who is the Director of Trade and Customs at the COMESA Secretariat. Dr. Onyango holds a PhD degree in economics from the University of Nairobi and has expertise in international trade, regional economic integration, trade and services, and econometrics. His skills and experience lie in CGE modeling with the GTAP model and other trade policy modeling tools. Dr. Onyango is joined by 2 colleagues from COMESA, Jane Kibiru, who is Research Fellow with expertise in economic and trade policy research, international trade, and regional integration, and Adam Willey, who is a trade policy expert with 15 years of experience as a research economist. Our 3 COMESA representatives, the floor is yours for a combined 10 minutes. Please go ahead.
First of all, to just appreciate the center, Dominique, Angel, and Ginger for inviting us to this, and of course our co-partner, the ECA, Stephen and Simon. I'll just try to go through a summary of this presentation, but just briefly to a short background about COMESA, formed in 1981, and transformed into COMESA in 1994, in conformity with the Lagos Action Plan and the final act of Lagos. It's one of the 8 regs recognized by the African Union, and it's also one of the largest regs in the region with 21 member states. In terms of scope of liberalization, COMESA launched the FTA in 2000, and currently there are 16 member states who are participating in the FTA regime, and a number of trade facilitation instruments have been developed to help run the FTA regime. Now, why regional integration and policy research? We think regional integration is critical, particularly in line with the aspirations of the African Union, because it helps overcome divisions across nations, which are impediments to flow of goods and services, as well as people in the region. It allows individual member states to improve their efficiencies in markets and also share the cost of public goods or large infrastructure projects, environment issues to do with climate change. I think my predecessors talked about them. It also helps in designing policies cooperatively in order to enhance the benefits of integration. And so policy research, of course, is being conducted under the GTAP framework, therefore helps regs to relate integration policy with theoretical and methodological developments. It also helps in identifying, I think, as already illustrated by evidence by the various studies that have been presented before, establish potential benefits, risks, and also challenges associated with such arrangements. Also critical is the harnessing of data and information to be able to conduct such research and analysis. And I think GTAP has done a wonderful job in trying to harness. Also important is of course, as expected, information to ongoing negotiations within various trade agreements, but more so not just negotiations, but then in helping in crafting evidence-based policy making in the process. And of course, the basis of such researches can be used to sensitize various stakeholders, particularly policymakers, in arriving at different decisions at the same time. It is useful in terms of assessing vulnerability of economies of participating members to internal and external shocks. So again, you can talk of several forms of shocks. We've had a financial crisis, we've had pandemic, issues of climate change, debt burden, as well as disruptions in global supply chains. So again, CE models stand a better chance of informing regs and individual member states on the extent of such shocks and of course, providing policy recommendations for the same. But also important in terms of leveraging on ICT developments, specifically the aspects of digitalization as well as data assembling, which we have talked about. At COMESA, we have done some studies, preliminary studies using the GTAP model. I will not go into the details because of time, but we have done a study on the socio-economic impacts of COVID pandemic in the COMESA region. And we have gotten some preliminary results, which we intend to share with member states. Of course, to enhance initial policy decisions that had been made in terms of tackling the implications of the pandemic. We've also done a study related to one of those that presented earlier on the impact of the AfCFTA on COMESA as a REC. Again, the results of this study are at the preliminary stages. But what is important is that the results of this study will be used to inform or provide inputs into the development of the COMESA strategy for implementation of the AfCFTA. Finally, as we look at it, the future of CGE modeling in Africa is bright. And this is considering the partnership. One of the challenges that we have in the region, and I think Stephen alluded to it, is the issue of resources to build data banks for member states. It's extremely expensive, and as you realize, I think the center, you have an example, you are not able to get this data as you want, as quickly as you want it, or as extensive as you may want it to be. So there still needs to be need to enhance investments in supporting member states to develop such appropriate data bank. And of course, there is always the issue of capacities to be able to conduct credible analysis and to be able to inform policymakers in member states on the likely implications of acceding to various trade agreements and negotiations. So this is still lacking in many member states, and hence the need for enhanced capacity building and training across board, particularly given that their member states are involved in a number of negotiations which are going on at the same time, whether at the regional level, at the continental level, and at the multilateral levels. Thank you very much, and apologies for the challenges that I experienced in this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christopher, and sorry for having misidentifying you, but thank you both, Christopher and Emmanuel, for your valuable perspective on these matters. We can open the floor for, let's say, about 5 minutes of questions and comments on these two presentations. So please use the chat or feel free to raise your hand.
Dominique, I just wanted to, before somebody asked the question, just to say that these two colleagues, Emmanuel and Christopher, they are both experienced negotiators and have worked closely with the key decision makers in this continent. So I think we've come a long way with them. So they have actually been very useful in at least unpacking most of the work that we do, especially during negotiations, because in those negotiations, as we are a secretariat or a technical partner, but they are the ones who make the decisions or at least guiding the decision making. So for those academics who are here, it's good to see how this process works. That Emmanuel and Christopher, they do the policy organs of the African Union or the regional economic communities that make decisions. But for the researchers, your work is to do a robust analysis using this kind of data and modeling and be able to present it to them. So to have people like them who have an understanding of how this works, it makes it easier for us when we are working with them. Just wanted to say that. And thanks, Emmanuel and Christopher, for joining.
Thanks so much, Stephen. Just out of curiosity, does COMESA have itself the capacity to run the GTAP model? Or do they rely mostly on external researchers?
No, let me answer part of this. Christopher benefited from one of the GTAP courses that we offered together. But Christopher, you can correct me.
No, you are right, Stephen. I am one of the alumni of the GTAP, and we have a small research team within the secretariat, and we do conduct small time, policy analysis and research. But of course, with assistance, collaboration with other external partners, including the ECA, as well as the JRC. And we are trying to venture into this modeling through capacity building. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a hand up. The name is Otieno. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Oh, thanks, Dominic. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. I would like to thank Emmanuel, my colleague Emmanuel, and Christopher from COMESA. I've worked with both colleagues. I used to work for COMESA some years back, and I would like to acknowledge that I was among the first beneficiaries of GTAP training way back in 2011. So when I was in COMESA, we were quite a number of colleagues who had some skills in utilizing GTAP, but at that time we didn't have the COMESA member states databases well covered. So the utilization was quite low at that time. But I think over time now, based on what Simon presented, it's high time now that the model would be very relevant. But one thing that Stephen has also not talked about was when we're grappling with the AfCFTA modalities for tariff negotiation, particularly agreeing on what percentage would be suitable for liberalization and what would be suitable for exclusion and sensitivities. Simon and the team had done something, and we, on their behalf, I made that presentation in Lusaka, Zambia. So I would like to appreciate that is the extent that we've been using products of GTAP over time. Thank you. I currently work for the Commonwealth in London.
Thank you very much.
It was the deal breaker, Dominique. I think we can say that openly because this is research. Essentially, we wanted to show that you needed to have sort of what we call double qualification. The number of tariffs that you liberalize must also have a coverage of trade for those colleagues who are attending here, because it's easy to open tariffs a certain percentage, but it touches on very limited volume or value of trade. So the team used GTAP to be able to demonstrate this is how you get effective opening up of the markets when setting up the modalities. Yeah. So thank you, Otieno, for this. Yeah.
Good. I think it's time to wrap up. I see there's still a little bit more questions or comments in the chat. We'll deal with those individually. I think on the database you'll get there was one question about accessing this specialized database for those that participated. We'll be releasing that, and let me get back to that. So I think this was a really successful workshop. I think the research and the policymakers highlighted kind of the two really critical aspects for the continent. One is, how do we enhance integration? What does it mean? What are the impacts for the individual countries and the people in those countries, as well as climate change and what are going to be the potential impacts there? And those could potentially far outweigh the impacts of integration. When you looked at the crop impacts that Tewodros was showing us, they were really quite significant. So were these to be realized, it would be quite something. So I really thank all the speakers for highlighting these two key issues and highlighting how GTAP has helped elucidate some of the main findings and provide some policy implications. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everyone for attending, especially our speakers and the UNECA for their partnership and support for this seminar. Let me remind you that the recording and presentation files will be posted on the GTAP website. When these are ready, we'll email everyone details on how to access these, as well as the free Africa-focused release of the GTAP database. Lastly, we hope to see many of you at next year's GTAP conference, which will be in Kigali, June 25th through June 27th in 2025. If you have work you might be interested in presenting at the conference, we will be accepting abstracts starting in early November through January 15th of 2025. To ensure you receive reminders about this event, we encourage you to subscribe to the GTAP-L mailing list or follow GTAP on social media. Thank you again for attending, and we hope to connect with you again at a future GTAP event.